Hello everyone, welcome back into the studio. Today we're going to do more mold making. Finishing up the Mohawk mask mold for the life-size Kronos portrait maquette is the objective of today. Last you saw him, we finished making the silicone skin, which will capture all the details of the clay sculpture. Today we're going to finish the mold by making a hard plaster shell, which will ensure the flexible silicone retains its shape. Let's get into it. First, we'll cover the materials that you will need to collect before beginning this process. You might not need all of these, but they are important in general to have for working with plaster, so you might as well get them. First, before any plaster work can be done, we must make a clay wall. Use a wire tool to slice off some clean slabs of clay. I have one with adjustable thickness, which keeps the slices even from one end to the other, but a simple wire tool will do the trick just fine. Cut the slab into even strips. As you can see, these strips of clay have a very clean surface, and this will save us a ton of time. With nice clean strips of clay about 8 to 10 centimeters in height, we're ready to begin building the clay wall in earnest. Starting with clean strips makes a huge difference and cuts down the working time a tremendous amount. We're building a clay wall because we need to separate the model mold into two halves. One model mold piece will get stuck on the sculpture since we have undercuts. Undercuts are places where the sculpture disappears over the horizon, if you will. If you think of a sphere and you wanted to make a model mold for that sphere, you would need to separate the model mold into two right at the apex of the sphere, where it's at its widest. If you separate below that, one model mold shell would get stuck on the sphere and never come off. And we have a similar problem here. As you can see, behind the ears, behind the cheekbones, behind the jawbones, and behind the beard, our sculpture disappears from view. These parts go over the horizon and disappear from view. Of course, we can move around the sculpture and see these areas, but we can never see them all, and this is where the problem lies. A plaster model mold is hard, so it only comes off in one direction, not multiple. We have to stand in the place where we think we have the least chance of undercuts, and in a portrait that's almost always going to be directly in the front. And then from there, imagine the model mold coming off directly towards us. If anything is blocked from view where we are standing, then we have undercuts, and we need to take our one model mold piece and turn it into perhaps two. Now there are other solutions, something called a plaster key, but these are somewhat complicated, too complicated for today, so we'll simply take our one model mold shell and split it into half directly down the middle of the face. As you can see from this 3/4 angle, which is the direction one model mold half will come off in, we have no undercuts from here. And the same is true from the other 3/4 view as well. This means we're good to go, and we can split our model mold directly down the middle, knowing that our plaster model mold, will come off directly towards us in the 3/4 angle. This is where the clay wall comes in. Instead of freehanding the plaster wall down the middle of the face, we can build a temporary structure of clay directly down the middle of the face. Well, one side of the clay wall is the middle of the face, the other side is a little bit to the right of that. This clay wall becomes the barrier which we will make the plaster model mold against. It's quite convenient because the clay wall will be of the correct height, placed correctly of course, and it will also have registration built into it, making sure that the two halves comes back together the same way every time. Once one model mold half in plaster has been finished, the clay will be removed and the other half of the plaster model mold can be made against the first model mold half we made. No clay wall needed, since now instead of clay, we have a plaster wall. It's back to our mold and time to start working with the plaster. And there are 3 steps to making a plaster model mold usually. We're going to combine 2 of these together a bit for the sake of time. So normally we do a splash coat on the surface and let that set up before starting step number 2. This time we're going to apply the splash coat of plaster, but instead of letting it set up, we'll just jump straight into step number 2. First, I cover the clay wall with plaster because it's the most fragile part, and the 90-degree turn from clay wall to silicone surface is the toughest part to get the plaster into, so we want to do that first. Then I'll brush plaster all over the rest of the surface. Notice how in some places the plaster slightly separates like oil on water from the silicone. We're not going to worry about this. Normally I'd let the plaster sit on the surface for a few minutes. The thin layer on the surface dries out faster than the mix in the bowl, and you can simply go over the surface twice to get an even coating. We're not really that concerned with the splash coat since we're doing this the expedient way. Make sure that even though we're working fast, we work clean, so no plaster gets on top of the clay wall or on top of the silicone wall. The first step is the splash coat, and normally we'd let this sit and become firm before proceeding. I've been experimenting with some quicker ways of working and find that the difference in result if I let the splash coat set versus just jumping straight into the next step is sort of minimal. So we'll jump straight into the next step, which is going to be the burlap reinforcement layer. Burlap is an open weave fabric that we use to reinforce the plaster and make it stronger, while at the same time keeping the mold light. Think of it like rebar in concrete or something like that. This will keep our mold light since we can use less plaster and get the same strength or perhaps even stronger mold out of using burlap. The burlap is dipped in plaster. We make sure the entire piece of burlap is soaked in plaster. The excess plaster is then squeezed out to make sure we don't create a mess or add too much plaster and weight, or rather more than we need to. The burlap is then applied to the surface and we carefully but firmly press it down onto the surface. Working clean still applies, so we don't want burlap up on top of the silicone or clay wall. If the piece of burlap is not cut perfectly to fit any given section, I will simply fold it over. I will let the burlap go slightly up the side of the silicone wall and about 3/4 of the way up the clay wall. This ensures that the wall portion of our mother mold is reinforced and doesn't break off. It ends up being a continuous part of the reinforcement layer. A big problem with the burlap layer is when it doesn't lay down well on the surface of the silicone. When this happens, you can get air pockets between the splash coat and the burlap layer. The thin splash coat will then break from the inside and you'll have a hole on the inside of your mold. Be very careful to not let the burlap stretch over any valleys in the surface. A technique that helps avoid this is to work the burlap from one edge of the burlap piece to the other side of it. Usually I'll confirm that the burlap is working well along the edges, or one edge, before moving inwards towards the center of the mother mold piece and the burlap piece. While I can fold the burlap over to make it fit inside the borders of the silicone and clay wall, I'd rather not have to fold it too much, and so working from the sides of the mother mold towards the center helps accomplish this goal. There will be 2 layers of burlap in total, and every piece of burlap that's applied overlaps the one that came before it. This way, we create a connected layer that gives maximum strength. When you do the second layer of burlap, try to make sure that you don't follow the same pattern as the first layer. Essentially, this gives even more strength as even more pieces are overlapped in multiple different ways. Timing is essential when working with plaster. Plaster goes through stages as it sets up from liquid to hard material. These stages are liquid, cream cheese, cottage cheese, and finally hard plaster. The splash coat and the burlap work should be done in the first phase when the plaster is liquid. If the plaster starts becoming thick like cream cheese, it's better to simply mix a new batch of plaster. Cream cheese plaster will be used for the third step in the plaster mother mold process. The cottage cheese stage is frankly a pretty useless stage when the plaster, in my opinion, should be abandoned. The timing of these stages depends on your plaster and the environment you're working in. And for me, here in Florence during winter, it's around 15 to 20 minutes, maybe a little bit more, from liquid plaster to hard plaster.